My special guest this evening is Robyn Andrews. Robyn Quail Andrews, C.Ht. CS.VD, is considered a pioneer in past life regression therapy and her extraordinary work with UFO abductees and contactees. She is a certified hypnotherapist, rebirther, parapsychological counselor, ordained minister, and intuitive. She does guided imagery work, past life regressions, spiritual releasement therapy, and a number of related processes. She has been featured on CNN, HBO, a Canadian network special, and numerous documentaries in the U.S. and Europe. Along with Dr. Raymond, Moody, and Dannion Brinkley, she was invited to Moscow to speak and appeared on 2 national television specials in Russia. For at least 10 years, she has become involved with the Rennes le Chateau mysteries and the secrets of the Templars, traveling many times to southern France. Using dowsing, regression, and remote viewing, she has interfaced with resident archaeologists to unearth the secrets of this amazing area. The best-selling novel, The DaVinci Code, has brought into the mainstream attention the focus on the mysteries that are centered in this area, with a highly heightened interest in the mysteries associated with Mary Magdalene, the Templars, Cathars, and the divine feminine influence. And please welcome Robyn to the show this evening. Robyn, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing fabulous, and thank you for being on the show tonight. It's wonderful to hear your voice. Welcome.
Okay.
Yeah, it's great. And let's get right into it and talk about the types of sessions you have been involved in, and how did you get involved in these past life regressions and alien abduction cases?
Well, I've been involved in the spiritual and healing world my whole life. My mother had a healing when I was 10 years old by a spiritual healer. And since then, I've been studying and opening up those avenues of every kind since I was, just a little girl. And so I got, when I moved to Atlanta in about 1970, I started doing hypnosis, and people just almost immediately started regressing spontaneously. And so at that time, there was no literature, there were no books, nobody knew anything about this. I had never heard of such a thing except the case of Bridie Murphy, which came out many years before, which I had read enthusiastically. And so I just sort of had to pioneer my way there and find out what was happening and how to guide people. And I had no idea in the beginning that it was so therapeutic. But I soon found out, and it became a passion of mine. And then it wasn't very long before the people were coming with their contactee and abductee stories and wanting to fill in the missing time with regression. And there wasn't much literature about that either. So again, I had to just feel my way. I was very sort of skeptical of a lot of it at first, but I could not imagine that people were being taken out of their beds and through the ceiling and onto ships and being impregnated and abducted and implanted and all sorts of things. It was just beyond anything. I knew a lot about UFOs, but I didn't know anything about this kind. There was no literature. And so I had a couple of experiences of my own that kind of helped cement my belief in that. And and then it just became a whole profession for me.
Wow. And did you notice a pattern or a similar thread in the fabric of the design of these abductees? Was there something similar that happened between all of them when they were being regressed?
Well, there's certain groups of them that are similar that since I've spoken at so many UFO conferences around the country, that I've compared with other researchers and regressionists, and we find similar patterns of certain types, but I found several other strains of experience that I don't think anyone else had delved into some years back in the 90s and explored that, and so it became another. It wasn't the usual abduction sort of stuff. It was more of a sort of, some people had been. I found a lot of people who had some kind of contact when they were children. And it wasn't like a ship came down and took them up or anything, but they had contact with some sort of a a person or being. And then their brains got rewired, and many of them developed extremely high IQs, and they started downloading very advanced technology and inventing things. And this all seemed to be coming from something that had happened to them when they were children. And many of them had never told anyone about their strange experiences. And so when I found a number of them, so I pulled them together in a group, and we had a meditation every week, and they were so happy, thrilled, ecstatic to be able to share their experiences with other people, because they were embarrassed to tell anyone how they were getting the technology, that it was being fed to them. And so they would I would put them under. I would do a guided meditation is what I would do, and there was a group of about 12 people, and then once they were in an altered state, say in the theta, we call it, then I would let them just free float, and they would come up with the most amazing things. One of them would say something like, he would be describing a schematic or a particular type of technology, and another one would say, oh yes, I see that too. And somebody else would say, and we could add this, and we could add that, and we could put a cube here, and we could put and all of a sudden many of them were tuning in just like the shamans used to do in South America when they would go into these rituals that they'd shared, things that they learned that way. And so then when they came out, they would be so excited, they would get paper and draw plans and things. And so many of them formed partnerships, and they were able to get that. I had 3 conferences only for these people, invited only conferences up in the mountains where nobody else came but these people. And there were about 40 of them that would come to the conferences, and some of them actually brought their technology, free energy type of motors, all sorts of things. Wow. That were like, this was in the 90s and they were getting 21st century technology. And I believe that most of our 21st century technology has come from extraterrestrial sources anyway, whether it came from the government back engineering crash saucers or extraterrestrials who are actually helping our government, helping many of our scientists and working. People have no idea the depth that they are involved in our society. No idea at all. And it was the highest secret our government has ever had. This and the advanced technologies which are being suppressed because they threaten industries. And so they can't let one out without the other. So, people are being compromised in many ways if they try to put this information out.
Very, very true. Well said. And when they were receiving this information for design, for technological design, was it through a type of telepathy? Do you know?
Well, you could call it that. I guess it was like they were downloading something, into their brains, and some of them could not even describe how they were getting it, but it seemed to be triggered by the experience that they had when they were children. And that many of them, the IQs doubled overnight. And
wow.
I could relate one particular story that's pretty amazing. This man who had a business here, he had a telescope that was very advanced beyond anything the government had, and you could see 10 miles in the dark with it, and it was not infrared or anything, and you could read. Well, I saw tests of it, and you could read for instance, a plane or a tank or something, you could, where the government's technology, you would see kind of a fuzzy outline. With this, you could see a clear outline and read the writing on the plane. Mm-hmm. And so, anyway, this man, when he was 9 years old, had already had some kind of experience, and then so his gift got out in the public domain a little bit. So he was invited. Now this is probably I'm estimating now because I haven't added up the year, about 60 years ago. He was invited to meet Albert Einstein at the New York Public Library. Well, you can imagine then this 9-year-old child taking the subway or something to the New York Public Library and going into this room where he met with Albert Einstein. And so Einstein was very respectful, and he had brought along this boy had brought along a paper that he had written about some type of time travelist, something. And Einstein offered to sign a non-disclosure and was very respectful. And after a meeting with him for a while, told him that he was very gifted, and he wanted to meet with him again the next day at the same time in the library. Well, the young man came back the next day, and Einstein was late. So after a while, he said that he was aware that there were three, I can't remember how he described them, whether he said they were men or beings or what, but there were three beings sitting across the table from him and in the special room they had given him. And so I began to ask him to describe these men or whatever they were, and he said that they had very close-fitting, sort of skin-colored clothes, and he said they were sort of like Nehru jackets. And then I asked him to describe their faces, and he said, well, they had very high foreheads. And then all of a sudden, and he was not in a regression, he was just answering questions. He was sitting on my sofa in my sunroom just answering questions. But when I asked him about the face and all, then all of a sudden he said, oh my God, they have no eyebrows. Well, at that moment, he entered a regression, you see, because he sort of entered an altered state where he was tuning back into them. Mm-hmm. And so then he said that each one of them he said they didn't speak words, but there was just like a flow of energy, of information, like a download going from their brain one at a time into his brain. And he got all of the sciences, all of the, math and everything, and all of the arts, and everything just poured into his brain, one after the other. And so when he returned to school, his IQ and his knowledge was so advanced that, it was almost impossible for him to remain in school. He would wind up teaching the class. And so he graduated from high school at about 12 years old and tried to go to college, but the same thing would happen in college. His knowledge was so far above his professors and everything that he would wind up just sort of taking over the class, and finally he just had to stop going because it was too stressful for everybody. And so he was awarded a doctorate here in Atlanta by the I don't know the exact name of the organization, Atlanta School of Inventors or something. Anyway, they gave him an honorary doctorate, and anyway, I had heard a recording where Ronald Reagan, before he was president, had a radio show, and he interviewed him on this show, and I heard that. But anyway, then he invented this telescope, and someone that I knew very well had worked on it in the company with him and helped develop some parts of it. And it was a very advanced kind of technology. But anyway, that was just one of the most extreme cases of these people who were getting this kind of technology, you know.
Mm-hmm. Wow, totally impressive. And
another man developed some sort of hydrogen separator that he put on cars and trucks that drastically reduced the use of fuel. And they put it on after we had those conferences, they were able to get some funding, and but there were just many things that were very interesting. But since this kind of technology is being so suppressed, it's very hard sometimes to get these things out into the public too, because it's a big threat to existing technology and existing industry and existing governments and everything else. So
oh, absolutely, it is. Yeah. And did your clients have trauma associated with their abductions, or would you say the abductions were more positive?
Some of both. I've never had any that were extremely traumatic, but I know some people have. Some children just take it in stride and talk about the little doctors that come in their room and seem to be buddies with them, but others get so frightened that they have to sleep in their parents' room, or they have to make little pallets of beds in their parents' room or in their beds, and they are really frightened. One of the people that was in my group remembers being abducted since he was just a young child, and he said his parents would be so distressed because they would find him outside at night. So they started locking the doors, and then finally they put locks up very high where he couldn't reach them, and they would still find him outside. And so one time when he had been out for a while, his mother was quite upset, and she said, "What are you doing out here?" And he said, "Oh, I just went up in the flying bookmobile." And that was kind of the way he saw it, a source of information. And but he never was troubled by it, and I've done many regressions with him, and he was all through his life, and many people have had this all through their life, and some have never remembered it or realized it, but with some it would be a great deal of stress until they did have some regressions that they finally knew what was happening. But this particular man had some amazing, he even had some healings. And I'll relate one if you want me to.
Oh, sure.
He was driving from Columbus, Georgia to Atlanta, which I think is about 60 miles away or something. And he woke up on the side of the road, his car on the side of the road, and he had been there for like an hour and a half, and he was quite disturbed because he didn't have any idea how that could have happened. And so the very next day, he was to go in to have a kidney stone, a process where they break up a kidney stone. He'd had several before. And so when he went to the doctor came in and said, "It's gone. You don't have it anymore." Well, he got really angry with the doctor. He thought they were very incompetent if they found a stone and now they can't find it. And so not too long after that, I regressed him, and he spontaneously went to that place where he was on the side of the road, and he was abducted by the gray aliens, which he had been up with them many times in the ships. And so he said they were doing their usual things, probing and so forth, and he didn't pay too much attention to that kind of stuff, but he got the idea. He said, "I wonder if they could fix my kidney stone." And so he tried to communicate that to them, and telepathy seems to be the means of communication, but they didn't seem to get it, and he thought, well, I'll make a picture of it. So he visualized the stone, and immediately they, the impression was, oh yeah, we'll take care of that. And so after a while, he asked them about it again. They said, oh, we've got, the impression, the telepathic impression was, oh, we've already done that. And he thought, they haven't done anything. But then the next day when he went in, you know, it was gone.
Wow.
And so he's had, but he was a person. Did you hear about the Contel case that I investigated?
Oh, I'd like you to talk about that if you could. Yeah, I've heard.
Okay, well, he was the main person that was because I had worked with him, you know, for years before. But he was an executive at this huge telecommunications company outside Atlanta. And I had another executive there who was a woman who was also a client of mine who'd been an abductee. And they didn't know each other at first, but I had mentioned one time that they should go to a certain lecture on UFOs or something. And the next day she remembered seeing this certain ring he had on, and she said, oh, you were there. And so they became friends, and they found out that they both worked with me and so forth. Well, this one particular day, a very unusual thing happened. He had gotten a Coca-Cola and a glass of ice and was walking toward his office, and he passed her and said something to her, and he said, not her usual friendly reply. She seemed sort of dazed and glazed over. But he went on into his office and put the Coke down and flipped on his computer, and then he was getting very, very woozy, and he was afraid he was going to fall asleep. And then after some time, he was coming out of it, and he realized that there had been like several hours, and everything on his computer the computer was completely down. Not only that, everything had been erased from it. And then he picked up the phone. The phone was dead. All the power was off. And all the ice for his Coca-Cola was totally melted. And so he goes in this daze out into the hall, and everybody is coming out of the office in the same kind of state, very confused and dazed and groggy, wanting to know what has happened. And because it was supposed to be a shift change, now this is a very suburban facility. It was way out in a place called Alpharetta, out north of Atlanta, and there was great wooded area around the building, very beautifully manicured, but highly secured with, you know, you couldn't just come and walk in there. And so you had to have a card to get in the building and a card to get out. So people that were supposed to come to work about 3:30 were still in their cars in their parking lot at about 5:30. And then people that were supposed to leave the building about 3:30 were still in the building at around 5:30. The times are not exact, but it's a couple of hours. And so this created mass confusion. You can imagine if people are supposed to pick up children and husbands and other meetings and all kind of things. And so everything was in chaos. Nobody knew what had happened or what to do. Well, there were on either side of the building, there were very large burned circles in the grass from 15 to 30 feet approximately in diameter. There were 5 in all. And later the landscape companies tried to replace the grass a number of times. It would just die. Finally, after much frustration, they had to take up about 8 inches of dirt and replace the grass. And someone took a picture a year later, and you could still see the grass was growing by then, but it was yellow. And there were many anomalies. Of course, this is a building that was built to withstand a nuclear attack. So there were 2 backup systems. Both of the backup systems failed. One was diesel, I believe, and one was something else. But the main power source into the building was in some, the wiring was in some kind of, what do you call that stuff that covers wires? Conduit. and it was melted. The whole conduit and everything was melted against the building, and none of the engineers could understand. They said there's not enough power to melt this stuff, and everything was just in this disarray. There was one man who worked in a lead-lined room with electronic doors. Well, he said everything started arcing in there, and the lights went out, but there were battery-operated red lights that came on, and then he couldn't get out because the electronic doors wouldn't open. And so I regressed this man, Tim, that was the main one that I was concerned with, and he of course said that he was taken out of the building by gray aliens, and that they were most interested in scanning his mind about how his brain worked with the computers. That's what he thought they were doing. And several other people were abducted. And so I was able to find out a little bit more a little later because there was a television show called, I think it was called Encounters. This is in 91 back then. And they wanted to do a special on this. And so they started, because there was so much security, and this Tim was afraid that he would lose his job because he had already been stonewalled in trying to investigate why things were erased from the computer and things like that. And so I got him on a television show in Atlanta, and he talked about this. And so after that, he got a lot of threatening phone calls and saying that he might lose his benefits and all kind of things if he didn't stop talking about this. And the company immediately started moving people from that facility to other states even. So only a skeleton crew was left at this, and he was one of them that was left at this facility. And they were supposed to merge with GTE, and which I think maybe they eventually did. But that day that happened, there was to be a big merger meeting at that facility about the merger. Well, the meeting didn't happen, and so he, but nobody, the management did not want to discuss anything about this. So the TV company contacted the landscapers and got a lot of the information about the grass and all. Well, they contacted a security firm, and the security firm had battery-operated movie cameras on the outside of the building. And what they said was that spaceships had landed and were taking people out of the building, and that aliens were taking people out of the building, and that people were frozen in their cars in the parking lot. Well, that's what appeared to be happening, and but we could never get hold of it. He said that management had confiscated that those tapes. Excuse me, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
And
water.
So we couldn't get beyond that, but
wow. That's pretty wild.
There was one other thing that was curious to me, and I haven't found out yet if it had any bearing, but you know who Dean Radin is? He was a famous scientist who was at the University, I believe it's the University of Nevada. Well, he was in Las Vegas, and when Raymond Moody was there for 2 years. And I read in a book, a magazine, that he was working for Contel at the exact time it mentioned that merger. And so I thought, well, he wasn't working at that particular facility. They had other facilities. But it mentioned that he was working for them and that he was working on a thought switch. And that's all it said. It didn't describe the technology or anything. And I thought, well, this is strange. I wonder if that could have anything to do with this at all. And so I tracked him down, and I tried to talk to him about it, but I'm sure if he was working on such a project, it was probably very classified to begin with, but he seemed to have no knowledge of what had happened, and if he did, he wasn't telling me.
Very interesting. Wow, and that was the only facility that was affected, right? Nothing else in that whole area?
No, not at all. Well, it was kind of, it was way out in the suburbs, and there were not any buildings close to it, and they had all this wooded area around it, and it was highly, you couldn't just drive in there and get out and walk in or anything like that. And these circles appeared, which was very indicative of something having happened there.
Oh yeah, it almost sounds like a directed energy weapon of some kind, but yeah, that's very, very interesting, without a doubt. Did you ever write a book on this or anything like that?
I wrote a book back in the 90s. I'm working on one now I'm almost finished with, but I worked on one back in the 90s about the prodigy children that I talked about, and I can't remember if that's in that book or not.
Very interesting. Is that still available? Oh
yes. You have to get it from me though. It was kind of a self-published thing.
Nice. So. And that's if people do want to get a hold of you, how would they do that? Would it be through your email?
My email is Robyn Andrews, which is ROBYN Andrews 912 @gmail.com.
Perfect. Yeah, that's awesome. And do you still offer sessions, or where are you at with that, with the regression?
Oh, sure, yeah, I still do, but I don't do so much anymore because I don't have an office anymore, and I speak a lot at, organizations and conferences and things, and so I guess you would call it a semi-retirement in the part of doing the regressions.
That's kind of nice. Gives you a little bit of a break there. And so far as the experiences with these abductees go, so obviously they were being downloaded with some kind of a data. What else were they witnessing or experiencing? Did they ever relay that information to you when they went through regression?
You mean these particular people that were,
no, just
that I called prodigy group?
Well, just about anybody, actually. Abductees in general, was there a pattern insofar as other things they were experiencing besides a download?
Well, there was one interesting aspect that is in that book. One of my abductee clients he worked in a delivery room, and one day she brought me something copied from a medical journal, and what it said was that 70% of women who were sonographically diagnosed to be carrying twins, 70% of those people only had one baby, and that there was no other atrophied fetus or anything. It was called the vanishing twin syndrome. And so Emory Medical College is here right in Atlanta, and so I went over to their medical library, and I read everything that I could find there on twins, and it backed up that all the way. It said 70% of these people only have one baby, and they couldn't figure out because it wouldn't be an atrophied fetus or anything. So I started wondering, since these people were being abducted and all, if and of course I haven't gotten to the part about abductees, but so many were artificially impregnated, especially young women of childbearing age. Sometimes they would be repeatedly impregnated. Some wouldn't even realize they were pregnant, but usually they were. And some weren't having sex at all who found themselves pregnant and verified it with pregnancy tests. And so and then about 3 months along, they're abducted again, and the fetus is taken. So anyway, so I was wondering if this had something to do with this. And so I was at a group meeting where there were some researchers. I asked if anyone had experience like this. And so one of the researchers from Asheville, North Carolina, said that he was a psychotherapist, I think. He said, well, when my daughter was born, I was in the delivery room, and there was the placenta on a table, on a tray, and he said there were 2 umbilical cords, but there was only one baby. And he said one cord was sort of, healed over, kind of. And he called the doctor over, and the doctor said, look, don't ask me. I can't explain it. There should have been 2, and I don't have any explanation for it. And so later, when the little girl was about 10, he was teasing her one day, and he said, you really were supposed to be a twin. And she gets very emotional, grabs his arm and says, Daddy, I know where my twin sister is. She's on the spaceship, and I talk with her all the time, or communicate with her all the time. And so then they began to talk about it quite a bit, and she decided to name her Corinne. And so he attended one of Stephen Greer's outings where he, on a mountaintop. Stephen Greer was from Asheville. You're familiar with Stephen Greer?
Oh, yeah.
And so he had these outings where he would use high-powered flashlights to make symbols in the sky, and spaceship, they would do a certain protocol of meditation and all. So spaceships were seen to come. So he was in one of those, and he pulled out a letter his daughter had written to her sister on the spaceship and read it to the group. And he said that a ship appeared right above them when that happened. But then he had one other thing. He went to a very renowned psychic in Florida, and she said, I always see discarnates on the left, and I see people who are in the body on the right, but this one is strange. It seems to go back and forth. And he said, oh, well, let me explain about the one on the spaceship. And she said, oh, of course. She said her name is Corinne, and said she has a message for you. She says that your daughter is very gifted as a singer, and she could be a great singer, and you must get very fine training for her. Well, they were already trying to budget a very good voice. They already knew she was good. So there were several things like that. It seemed to confirm, for them that this was real. And so I met the daughter later when she was a young teenager, and we talked about it, and she was just in constant communication. Well, another one of my clients who is in my group that I talked about, she had been taken back to the ship and shown about 30 little children and little hybrid children, and told that they were all hers, and they wanted her to interact with them. Well, this is what I found out from many other researchers. Sometimes they ask people, see, they have a hybrid child, and the gray aliens seem to have a little or no emotion. But humans, if they're hybridized with their part human, they need nurturing, they need love. And so they realized that these children were not flourishing, so they were asking the mothers to come back, and some would be even asked to nurse them or to cuddle them or to massage them, and then as they got older, to interact with them. So she was asked to interact, and she would kind of teach them to hold hands and play, and try to teach them, to be loving and maybe sing or something. So anyway, she said that she had learned to telepath with them. And she said, I'm teaching them to be very independent, and the aliens don't like that at all. So she came one day after that, we talked about that for another session, and she was going to try to communicate with them during the session. So I was recording this, and everything was going fine until she got to the part where she was going to communicate, and the tape recorder just jammed up. I couldn't move anything on it, not any button or dial or anything. It was frozen. And so I went and got another one, and the exact same thing happened. I went and got a third tape recorder. Same thing happened. and they were totally frozen. And, you know, a few days later, all 3 tape recorders were perfectly all right.
Wow.
And so they were just not going to allow that to happen. And they are, of course, able to affect cars and all kind of technology, it seems, at times. And so that was that. But I've had many people say that, you know, they weren't having sex at all, and yet they found themselves pregnant. And one girl told me, she said, I consider myself a lesbian, but she said, I wasn't having sex with anybody. And she said, I was terrified to go out of the house. And so her story is very fascinating. She was working at a military base in Colorado, and she worked in a lab, I guess you would call it. And sometimes she said there were babies born, stillborn, that were very strange looking, and it was her job to communicate with the parents, see if they wanted to see the fetus or the child, the baby, the dead baby, or if they wanted it there, all that sort of stuff. But she said some of them did not look totally human. And then one time when she was looking in a microscope at something that was already in there, she saw a very strange blood anomaly, and she got caught on the carpet for that big time. Well, anyway, she found herself pregnant, and she wasn't having sex. So this is one of the strange cases, because this is totally different from any of the others I've ever experienced. Most of them were just taken aboard the ship. But she felt that she had been drugged and was taken down in an elevator to a basement sort of room, and that she was put on a table, and that there were the gray aliens were taking the fetus, and the people that worked there that had on hospital garb and all were just standing back against the wall watching. And so then after that happened, she was taken to another room, and she said there was just a bare light bulb hanging down over her face, and a man that she didn't even know was bending over her, a human man screaming at her, you won't remember this, you won't remember this, you won't remember this, and things like that. And she was very frightened. And she said then, after a while, she found herself up on the grounds, and there was a very high, I can't remember the exact rank of I think it was a major, but somebody in the military of a high rank that she didn't know, but acting very friendly, was just strolling with her around the grounds. And every now and then he would ask her if she was okay, if everything was okay, and that went on for an hour or so, and she didn't. I assumed that maybe they wanted to see if she was remembering anything, or if she was going to hemorrhage, or, you know, if everything would be cool and she would forget everything. Oh. So anyway, all this stuff made her so paranoid and so frightened of anything to do with the government since she'd moved to Atlanta then, and everything. And she was very frightened. She came to a group party, a meeting, you know, I had here, and there was someone there who spoke to her, and she said, well, what do you do? And he said, well, I'm with the government. Well, you could just see her face freeze. I mean, she just was terrified. And, you know, he was in some innocuous profession with the government. But anyway, I tried to, in working with her, I tried to allay some of the fears, some of the regressions. You can get rid of a lot of the fears, especially like with children who've been traumatized by that sort of thing.
Right. And what year was that for that woman?
I beg your pardon?
What year was that with this woman when she had that event?
Well, it was in the, I would say the mid-90s,
Okay.
Maybe that she was here and I regressed her, but it had been several years before that she had that experience. So, you know, there have been several cases of where people are taken aboard ships and they see military people on the ships as well as the aliens. And I've got several very interesting cases I can talk about if you like, where people have observed that. And one man, just regularly, he said sometimes they would have on a hospital garb, and it would say, would have a name tag and everything on them. And so most of the time they were they were not participating, but sometimes, in his particular case, sometimes they were. But one of the most interesting cases was a case down in near the Alabama-Georgia line and south of Atlanta, and a small town. And I had been working with this man for quite a while because he had some amazing regressions, and he had seen a lot of ships very close. And I spoke with the chief of police. I spoke with some real estate people. I spoke with cheerleaders and many people who had some very close encounters. The whole cheerleading team was working out, and 3 ships were overhead and shine these lights right down on them, and the parents and the students and everything saw this. And then one lady described how a ship came down very close over the trees in their yard, and she was very frightened, and her husband said, "No, I'm just going to let them take me up." But she developed cancer and died very soon after that. But anyway, the main thing that he was very interested in him, so he was an uneducated man, but very Christian, very sweet little family. He lived with his mother and his 12-year-old son. And he worked in the backyard. He had a sign painting business, and he would work out there late at night. So every night he would take a break, and he would get in his car and go down to the little store and get a Coke, and then he would make a circle back through a wooded area where he had often seen UFOs. So that was kind of his routine. And so one night he was on this road. It was kind of in a wooded area, and the ship came down very low over his car, and his car died. Well, he didn't remember anything after that until he came to in his car sometime later, and he was so terrified that he drove on, and when he got to the very first house he could find, he went to the door, even though it was late at night, knocking on the door. He was terrified. So after that, he wouldn't even go out of his house at night, not even to his shop in the backyard. So I went down and regressed him, and so what happened was that he was taken up in the ship. And on the ship, there were 2 military people. One seemed to be an enlisted man, and the other seemed to be a 3-star general, because he very carefully drew. He's a good artist. He drew the cap and the stars and even carefully drew the insignia and described it was, I believe, a blue uniform with the Army insignia. Well, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But anyway, there were several of the gray aliens on the ship, and they had him on a table, just doing what they usually do, the examination and thing. And then they were suddenly, he said, trying to do something to his eyes, and he smelled something like, and the military man ran over and yelled at them to cut it off. And then he was given sort of resuscitation, and one of the military men said, "Oh my God, I thought we'd lost you there." And then he was taken back to the ship. Well, I mean, back to his car. And so that's when he, of course, he didn't remember any of that at the time. But in the regression, when he was taken back to the ship, he said he recognized these two aliens that took him back to the ship. He said it was like he had known them all his life, and he felt very, very sad because he felt like he would never see them again. So later, I spoke about this at an Atlanta conference on UFOs, and there was a man from Fort McPherson who was a military colonel, came up to me afterwards.
Okay, Robyn, we're heading for a break real quick. We'll continue that story when we get back at Ravenstar's Witching Hour. Take care.
Okay.